The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to another great webinar from CPA Academy. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Autumn and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar on Diversity and Inclusion One-on-One, Disability Inclusion. Our presenters today are Jina Etienne and Andrew Imparato. Before we get started, I wanted to go through some housekeeping items and do some technical checks to make sure everything is working. First, if you don't mind going to the GoToWebinars Questions tab on the control panel and letting me know that you can hear my voice and see the title slide. Feel free to also let us know where you're chiming in from. I always enjoy that. And if anyone has any technical issues, please let me know in the questions panel. I'll do my best to get around to all of you as quickly as I can. This is also where you can put your questions and comments for the presenter. Let's check in. Wow, I see a lot of y'all chiming in. Thank you. James from Ohio. And we have Melanie in Reno. Welcome, welcome. Let's see, can everyone hear me and see me? Okay, great. Now that I know that everything is working, let's go through some housekeeping. This is a 1-hour webinar and qualifies for 1 CPE credit. The way you earn that credit is fairly straightforward. Just stay logged in for 50 minutes of our allotted time and answer the poll questions. We'll have 4 polls, and to earn full credit, you will need to answer at least 3 of them. If you're on a mobile device, you might need to click your answer a few times and scroll down to find the submit button. And if you have to log out and log back in for any reason, our system will keep track of your time. I wanted to let you know that we are recording today's webinar, and the archive, along with your CPE credit, will be available in your CPA Academy account within 24 hours. We also recommend that you download today's presentation materials, which can be found in the control panel's Handouts tab. Now that we're all set, let's welcome our presenter. Jina, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Autumn, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And I have an amazing guest with me today, Andy Imparato. He is the Executive Director at Disability Rights California. Before joining Disability Rights California, Andy spent 26 years working in DC on disability advocacy and policy. His efforts include representing the disability rights community on the Executive Committee of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and also serving as the Disability Policy Director for Chairman Tom Harkin on the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. And that's just to name a few. You can see his bio here. It's pretty impressive. Trust me, that list is long and impressive. I met Andy when I was at Grant Thornton, and we were preparing for a BRG, Business Resource Group. We were preparing for a conference, and I've stayed in touch with Andy over the years. And so, Andy, thank you for joining us and sharing this conversation. I'm excited for this today.
Thanks, Jina. It's great to be here.
So before we jump in, I always ask our guests one question to kick things off, and that is, why is this conversation important to you?
So, I'll wear different hats in my response to that question. First, as a person with lived experience with bipolar disorder, if we can build work environments that are truly inclusive for people with disabilities, people like me are going to thrive and are going to do better. For me, my career has been my most important mood stabilizer. It's helped me navigate the ups and downs of my disability. And I've been very blessed and lucky that I've found lots of work environments that have been able to welcome and accommodate me as a person with a psychiatric disability who has been out and open with my disability for my whole career, going back to the early 90s. I'm also a manager. I'm the executive director of a legal services organization in California that has 290 employees across 26 offices, over 100 attorneys. So if we can build an environment at Disability Rights California that's truly inclusive and welcoming for everyone, then we're going to do better at advancing our mission. Right now, 2/3 of our employees are people of color. 1/3 of our employees are people who self-identify as having a disability. So I'm really working hard to try to build a culture at Disability Rights California where everybody feels welcomed and valued and able to bring their whole selves to work.
I love that. And I will tell everybody, I also have a disability. I was recently, a couple years ago, diagnosed with epilepsy. And I have ADHD. Apparently, I've had that all my life. Which explains some of the challenges I've actually experienced that I couldn't put a finger on. So it's one of the, actually, hold on. I don't want to give away a statistic. I actually want to start with the polling question. So Autumn, can we launch that first poll? I'm curious to see what the answer is.
All right, here is poll number 1 out of 4. As a reminder, we'll have 4 polls during this presentation. You just need to answer at least 3 of them to earn your CPE credit, and we'll leave each open for about a minute.
So the first question is, I can't see it. So is it the one, what percentage of people live with a disability?
Yes.
Yes. All right, Andy, where are you seeing it?
I'm seeing it on my screen.
What percentage of people worldwide live with a disability? Is it 90, 35, 15, 5%, or not sure? All right, looks like we have just about everyone voted in. I will go ahead and close this down in 3, 2, and 1. Sharing those results, it looked like the majority with 61% said 35%.
And so I want to move to the next slide then, because the World Bank estimates that worldwide, it's closer to 85%, 15% of the population that are living with a disability. And so I think 35% said I can't read my numbers. 61% said 35%. Look, I might be a CPA, but I do not do spontaneous math. So, but it's interesting because I think a lot of people, if it's not visible, if I can't see it, then it's not a disability. And there's some perception to that.
Yeah, Jina, if I can comment on the responses, you know, the people that said 35% were not necessarily wrong, because it really depends on how you define disability. Mm-hmm. When the World Bank says it's about 15% of the population, they're using a relatively narrow definition of disability that does not include everybody with a chronic health condition who's protected by civil rights laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you use the broad definition in the ADA, 35% is a very reasonable answer to that question.
Thank you. So the next question actually that I want to ask is the second polling question. And I know we don't usually do them back to back like this because of the CPE, but I thought it would be helpful to frame the conversation. So can we go ahead and launch that one too, Autumn?
Sure, here is poll number 2 launched. And this one is, what percentage of disabilities are invisible? Is it around 95%, 57%, 22%, or not sure? I'm very curious to find out this answer myself as well. Very interesting statistics.
Are you allowed to vote in the poll as a moderator?
It won't let me click, but I usually, I have to admit, I go with the majority. I trust our attendees. I'm going to go with their vote. All right, looks like we have just about everyone in. Closing down here in 3, 2, and 1, sharing those results with y'all. 57% said 57%. Look at that.
So I don't know, Andy, do you want to comment on these?
Well, my understanding, I actually don't know the answer to this, Jina. My understanding is that the majority of disabilities are not visible. So I would have answered 57%. 95% seems too high to me. And if it's a majority, then it is over 50. So I would have said 57%.
So the numbers vary to your point. I've seen a statistic that says, and it's actually not the answer here, so I realize I framed the question wrong. I wrote these polling questions, but it's about 70% was my understanding of the people that have disabilities that are invisible. Like mine is invisible, and I seem able-bodied all the time. And in fact, I have the form of epilepsy that I have, and a lot of people think epilepsy is I have to be falling on the floor and doing what you see in the movies. But in fact, my form of epilepsy is not something you would necessarily know when I'm having a seizure. My husband, I asked him the other day, what happens when I'm having one? And so he started showing me physically what happens. Mine are called non-focal awareness. I just look like I've stopped paying attention. But I have no memory of what happens in the moments leading up to it and the moments after it. it's gone from my memory. I'm physically not around for anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. And they can escalate. So it's interesting because if nobody explained that, they wouldn't even think that was a disability. I would just look like I'm checked out.
But it's also interesting to think about what situations make a non-visible disability visible. So if you're deaf and you're walking down the street and you're not talking in sign language to somebody else, you have a non-visible disability. But when you start signing, your disability becomes more visible. If you have a visual impairment, when you pull out the white cane, it may make your disability visible for somebody who otherwise wouldn't know that you have a visual impairment. So it's there's situational visibility. As lawyers, we can kind of dissect those questions, but 57% sounds legitimate to me, again, depending on how you define disability and how you define visible.
One of the things we've been learning as a result of the pandemic and people being at home, there have been some really interesting stories that have come up. Some are very moving and emotional, where you hear people who have not revealed to their employer that they have a disability. But because of the technology, they've had to reveal something that they otherwise would have not wanted to reveal. And while this isn't on point, it's the type of situation I'm talking about. I heard a story recently about an employee that was homeless. They did not want their employer to know they were homeless. So when they had to move and work from home, the employee kept dodging and hemming and hawing because they didn't want to have to reveal that. Just like we know, Zoom didn't offer closed captioning. And so people who were relying on other forms of communication, if you're in a room and you can read somebody's lips, you have become very good at reading the room and compensating, is that the right word, for whatever disability you're working through or that you have. And when you end up working from home, everybody can see it. And to your point, even if I started doing sign language on the street, somebody might think I was deaf, but it might be because my husband is. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of us see disability solely as wheelchair, blind, deaf. After that, we're not really sure of what they are. And one of the things I have on the screen are different barriers for employees when it comes to employees with disabilities, because they're not understanding, well, what do you mean by barriers? We've got a ramp. They can get into the building. So what has your experience been, especially as a lawyer, in trying to advocate for these types of removing these barriers or addressing these barriers?
Yeah, well, first, there's a limit to what a civil rights law can do in terms of removing barriers. If you think about somebody that grows up with an intellectual disability like Down syndrome, they're going to have barriers related to their education where they may not have as much time in a regular education classroom as other children. They may not have the kind of socialization opportunities as other children. They may not get exposed to the general education curriculum in the same way as other children. And then as they age out of their K through 12 education, they may not have an opportunity to pursue higher education. There is an inclusive higher education movement that's trying to open up more higher education opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities. And then, when they show up for a job interview, they may not kind of know naturally what to wear, how to respond to cues, what to say and what to not say in a job interview. There are lots of things that can happen along the way that can create barriers to them having success in the labor market. And some of those things, there are civil rights laws that protect them, and some of those things are more intangible and hard to get at with a civil rights law. I think one of the most important ways to address barriers is to create opportunities for people with disabilities to have positive work experiences while they're still in school, for people that have childhood onset disabilities, and for people that acquire a disability while they're working. getting them back into work in some capacity quickly after the onset of a disability can have a huge impact in terms of their ability to successfully navigate the workplace with a disability after that onset. If they stay out of the labor force for years and then try to come back, it's often much more difficult.
I saw somewhere, and I wish I'd written it down now, the statistic for people with disabilities, the higher rate of unemployment. And I was thinking about what you just said, how that rate is influenced by what you said, somebody who later in life acquires a disability and then they leave work, how much more difficult it is to come back into the workforce.
Yeah, and the unemployment rates for people with disabilities don't tell the whole story, right? Because unemployment is a term of art. It means that you're not currently working, but you are actively looking for a job. And the vast majority of working age adults with disabilities are not in the unemployment rate because they're not actively looking for a job. About 2/3 of working age adults with disabilities are not in the labor force at all. So they don't show up in an unemployment rate.
That's a very good point. I do want to, I put some slides together just to show people about your organization. And so they're just really to help people understand where the organization that you lead. You were actually talking about another role that you have. But can you tell us a little bit about what Disability Rights California does?
Yeah, so Disability Rights California is one of 57 federally funded legal services agencies for people with disabilities. There is a protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities in every state and territory. And our funding is proportional to the population of our state. So Disability Rights California is by far the biggest legal services organization serving people with disabilities because California is such a big state. And we do free legal services for people with all types of disabilities across the lifespan. So, we do education cases, we do employment cases, we help people get benefits that they're entitled to, including getting services from the State Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. We do public policy advocacy, which is really my background. I'm more of a policy wonk than I am a practicing attorney, although we do have a lot of practicing attorneys on our staff. And we do trainings. We help people know their rights. We help people access information in multiple languages. And it's interesting. The history of our network started when Geraldo Rivera went to Willowbrook, an institution for people with intellectual disabilities, and exposed the abuses that were going on behind closed doors in that institution. And Congress created our network as a way to protect people against that kind of abuse. So we started out serving people in institutional settings, and we still do that. We still monitor institutional settings for people with intellectual disabilities and mental health disabilities and really any disability. But obviously, a lot of our work now is trying to help people get what they need in the community, not in an institutional setting.
Can you explain the difference between protection under the EEOC versus the resources and support and protections from the ADA?
So I'm not sure, let me make sure I understand your question. I worked at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for 3 years for Paul Miller, who was a Clinton appointee, who was a commissioner there. So the EEOC enforces all of the civil rights, the federal civil rights laws in the workplace, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, the employment provisions in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that part I understand, but when you say the difference between the ADA and protection, I'm not sure what you're referencing.
Well, I think what you just said answers the question that I apparently didn't ask very well. And that is, what is the relationship between those two? So
in terms of the relation between my organization and the EEOC is the government. So it's a government enforcement agency. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. So we're a federally funded, government funded advocacy organization but we're independent from the government. So for example, we can sue the government, and we do sue the government. But sometimes we partner with the Department of Justice or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on a case. Like there are cases where we'll work together. But the big difference is we are private, non-governmental, and EEOC is the federal government.
So there are some questions coming in, by the way. I'm going to be watching the Q&A, and I might throw some questions out at you. Before I start, scrolling through those, a couple things came to mind. When we think about, so when I'm doing training, for example, D&I training, and we talk about the words that we use in the language of diversity and inclusion, some people say that they're afraid to even talk about this issue because they don't know the terminology. We've heard the term disability, we've heard disabled. Long ago, for years, we've heard handicapped. What's the right way how do you use these words? And are there any words we shouldn't be using?
Yeah, it's interesting. The language around disability continues to evolve. There are some people in the disability world who like what they call people first language. So they prefer that you say a person with a disability instead of a disabled person. There are other people that like identity first language. For example, in the autistic self-advocacy world, they like referring to themselves as being autistic or as being an autistic person. They would not call themselves a person with autism. So I think the best thing to do is listen to people with disabilities and use the language that they're using to describe themselves. The other thing that I like to point out when we talk about language is it can be very elitist to expect everybody to use the right language in all circumstances, because not everybody has been exposed to whatever is considered the kind of most current usage of language for disability. So I try not to have a strong negative reaction when somebody uses outdated language. I try to listen for what is their message. And if they have a good message, but they're not using kind of up-to-date language, then I try to gently let them know there's another way to say that. So to kind of the last part of your question, yes, generally it's not good to use the term handicapped. You're not going to see a lot of disability leaders using that term. Part of the reason we rally around the word disability, even though it's obviously not a perfect word, is it's our political word. Our civil rights law is called the Americans with Disabilities Act. Our membership organizations that represent our civil rights are called the American Association of People with Disabilities, the National Organization on Disability. So as long as the disability community is using that word as our political word, and that's the word we're rallying around as a movement, you're on very solid ground to use that word.
That's actually very helpful. So thank you. And I think I really appreciate your remarks about let's extend some grace. Because what's true here in terms of the language of disability is true in a lot of the different communities, the minority groups, if you will. I just had Brian on 2 weeks ago talking about the gay community and the LGBTQ plus acronym and why is it so long and what are the words that we're allowed to use and pronouns. And so much of it is what we want to prescribe on others rather than, as you say, let's listen to how people in those communities and groups describe themselves and let's learn that language. I think that's a great tip that we can use more broadly. A question about work. So I'm kind of moving in a completely different direction. If somebody is getting an assistive technology or somebody is getting a tool, is that considered equity? Is it fairness? What is it just compliance with the law? And so employees shouldn't see differences of resources as differences, somebody getting more than somebody else, especially when that disability is invisible.
Yeah, so I think it fits under the category of equity. The way I understand the word equity, the concept is you sometimes have to treat people differently in order to bring them to the same level of access and opportunity as someone else. And that can be hard for some people to understand. Some people think equal opportunity means you treat everybody the same. But in the disability world, that just doesn't work. If you treat everybody the same, some people with disabilities are not going to have equal access because they actually need something different than what other people need. You know, a good example is if you have an office that is not wheelchair accessible, for one of your folks in a wheelchair, you're not providing the same access that you provide to your other employees. So I think equity is the right frame. It's not uncommon for coworkers to resent accommodations for people with non-visible disabilities, or sometimes for people with visible disabilities. So I think, you know, it's important as part of an orientation for new employees and as part of kind of a statement about the values of a company to explain that whole concept of equity, that we have people that are coming to us in different situations, different life experience, and there are going to be times that in order to advance our core value of equity, we have to treat people differently. But we should be able to explain that, and the organization should be able to accept the differentials in treatment and accept that people with disabilities have a right to not disclose their disability to their entire group of coworkers. And you know, in general, I think it's good for folks to think about, what do I need personally to be as productive and successful as I can in my job? And if I'm getting what I need, if somebody else is getting something else that I'm not getting, and it's helping them perform better, it's none of my business. I mean, I think to some degree, people need to focus on their own needs and not worry so much about what somebody else is getting.
I think there's a lesson in that for all of us about a lot of things. And so you touched on something. I'm going to come back to it because I'm worried about polling. So should we go ahead and do the third poll, Autumn?
Sure, here is poll number 3 out of 4. I will leave it open for about a minute. This one is, do you know or work with someone with a disability? Yes, no, not sure, or prefer not to answer.
And for those of you, just so you know, I see the questions coming through. And so we will make a little bit of extra time to get through some of these questions. So
all right. And we have a lot of people on the webinar today, and everyone is voting in super, super fast. I love it. It looks, we already have 95% of everyone voted in. I will go ahead and close down here in 3, 2, and 1. Sharing those results. Oh, there we go. Sharing those results. 63% with yes. Back to y'all.
That's fantastic. I don't mean that's fantastic that I don't want to make it sound like it's fantastic, the number of people with disabilities. It's more about disability awareness, because two things now. The first one is, if people don't know what disability means, and if people don't know that there is such a thing as an invisible disability, we've got an uphill, climb just to get to the level of knowing that something is there. That is a huge blind spot. The other thing that I thought about earlier, which, as I said, hold that thought, was stigma. If an employee is resenting another employee for getting something and they don't see why, there are a lot of people who don't want to reveal that they have a disability, even to their employer, let alone to their colleagues, because of the stigma, because of the bias. I should probably not use, I think we overuse the word bias in some cases. There's stereotyping that happens, and the impact on them could be career limiting. Have you found that to be what people have come to your organization about and trying to get help with?
Yeah, but I think it's worth remembering that when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, one of the goals of the people that worked on that legislation was to protect people's privacy. And there are specific requirements that employers protect confidential information about disabilities so that it doesn't come back to hurt people in the workplace. But the ADA does not prevent employers from trying to create an environment where people want to be out and open with their disabilities and see that as an asset in the workplace. So in my organization, our mission is to advance the rights of people with disabilities. I want all of my employees who have lived experience with a disability to be out and open. Obviously, I'm not going to force them to be out and open, but I want to create an environment where they want to be out and open and they want to talk about their lived experience and connect it to our mission. I think in the context of accounting, you know, if you're working in a professional environment where you're serving corporate clients, if you have folks that have lived experience with disabilities and they can connect with folks in their client organizations who have lived experience with disabilities, it can help you build your book of business. It can help you build a deeper relationship with your clients. So I think in any setting, if somebody can find a way to be out and open with their disability and use it as a positive differentiator, to me, that's where we want to get as a society. I understand why the ADA protects confidentiality, personal information, but sometimes I feel like we get so focused on the right to privacy that we miss the opportunity associated with people having a visible identity, you know, a positive identity around being a person with a disability, whether you can see the disability or not.
I guess I can understand the desire to, if you will, hide or hold back, as particularly an invisible disability. It gets back to that culture in an organization. And what we're talking about, when you hear there's so much now about diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, when you're talking about a culture of inclusion, that's creating a space that's safe. And that's a space where all of us can be appreciated for who we are despite our differences. And, you know, I'm a Black woman, at least I appear to be, right? I can't hide that. I can't hide my skin color, but I can hide my disability. And so there's this pressure to assimilate in corporate culture rather than celebrate those differences. But we do know that when companies are more diverse, and diversity in leadership in particular, they actually perform better. And we know that employee performance is better. Innovation rates are higher. And to your point, stickiness with customers and clients improves. And there's an increase today in, just look at what's, well, I won't go to politics, sorry. There's an increase today in the demand for people, the demand of customers and clients to see that the companies they do business with and buy from take a stand and show their, and publicly say what their values are, including diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting aspects of the business case around disability inclusion is something that I learned from a senior executive at Walgreens. He had a son on the autism spectrum, and he was in charge of their distribution centers, which is a pretty big job for Walgreens, a lot of distribution centers. And he built a distribution center in Anderson, South Carolina, where he intentionally had 40% of the employees be people with disabilities, all types of disabilities. He was inspired by his son to try to create opportunities for people like his son, but his son was on the autism spectrum, but this distribution center was hiring people with all kinds of disabilities, including people with epilepsy and other disabilities. And he found that that distribution center outperformed all of his other distribution centers. And I asked him, what do you think is the strongest business case for hiring a lot of people with disabilities and doing it intentionally? And he said, employee engagement. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, the people that worked at that distribution center felt like they had a purpose that was bigger than making money for Walgreens. And that feeling of purpose made them perform at a higher level. They were less likely to leave. They were more likely to shop at Walgreens, and they felt better about the company.
Those are all the data points that support diversity and inclusion. Thank you. That's a fantastic story. All right, so I want to get to these questions because I see I'm worried that we're going to run out of time because I have more questions too. But let me look at the Q&A. So here's one. What's the best way to start a conversation with someone about their disability, especially invisible ones? does bringing it up, it's a long one, does bringing it up with them make them feel more vulnerable? I know in the LGBTQ community, it definitely makes a difference in the delivery. Can you initially put someone on guard if you're not sure why they're asking? It can.
Yeah, disability is such a diverse category that it's hard to answer that question generically. I think, exercising good emotional intelligence, paying attention to verbal and nonverbal cues, and really trying to meet the person where they are is, to me, the best strategy. I interview people for jobs in my organizations, and I've worked in disability policy and disability advocacy organizations throughout my career, government and non-government. And I often ask the question in a job interview, why are you interested in working for this organization? And that's me creating an opportunity for the person I'm interviewing to talk about any lived experience they have that is connected to our mission. But I don't ask them, do you have a disability? Because that's illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think sometimes if you think somebody might have a disability and you want them to talk about it, it helps if you can talk about your own disability or your interest in disability or the importance of disability to the company and to the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging strategy of the company. And you can also say to somebody, do you have any thoughts about how we could be better as an employer for people with disabilities? Because again, that's an opportunity for them to share their lived experience if they choose to. So I think just giving people those opportunities and paying attention to how they respond, whether they're comfortable or not comfortable, is a good strategy. But it is going to vary, from person to person. Some people are going to come into an organization with a strong disability identity. Some people are going to have to develop that. In my organization, I came in a year ago as an out and open lawyer with bipolar disorder. And I would say that probably 20 of my employees in the last year have disclosed to me their lived experience with mental illness, but they haven't historically felt comfortable being out and open about that, even in an organization that has a disability rights mission. So some of it is also just who do they have in their life that's influencing how they think about disability. If your spouse and your parents and your siblings are all telling you, don't tell anybody that you have a disability, it's only going to be used against you, then that's kind of the message that you're carrying with you into the workplace. And, I think we have to unlearn some of those messages in order for us to be out and open and proud of our identity as people with disabilities.
Right. So I wrote down from what you were saying, we really need to think about the different groups, the different minority groups, and understand how to approach each one differently, because there isn't a universal way to ask somebody about what makes them different. What came to mind is that if somebody in the office is gay, lesbian or gay, and they've not come out, how do you ask them about that? If you should ask them at all. And it's going to be a different way to frame that question, to your point. So I think that's great advice. And there's so many universal ways to take the advice that you're sharing with us today. I'm looking at the questions. It's hard because I want to hear you and then I want to read the questions at the same time. What is an incorrect job requirement or challenges with HR recruitment? So is there something somebody can be putting in the job description that is not appropriate?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of companies, and this is a problem in the private sector, but also in government, they'll have requirements in a job description that carry across all of their job descriptions. They're just kind of generic requirements. So one of them might be you have to be able to show up at an office at 9 o'clock every day, or you have to be able to lift 5 pounds, or you have to be able to travel independently. Who knows? They come up with all of these specific requirements. And, there's nothing wrong with like listing these things as aspects of a job, but I think it's important to say with or without an accommodation. So if you need to be able to travel the job, okay, how can we support you to travel if you're a blind person or you're a person in a wheelchair, and how is that going to look different from you? And are there times where maybe you don't have to travel and you can participate virtually, which is obviously something we're all learning more and more how to do. I think the whole world is going to travel less after COVID, and I think that's going to open up more opportunities for people with disabilities who can't travel as much as some businesses expect their folks to travel. So I think it's just good to individualize, think hard about the specific job, and always ask yourself the question, as you're posting a new position, is everything in this job description, are all of these essential functions really essential? And try to think of people who may not be able to do those functions. Do you want to exclude them because of that?
Right.
And for most jobs, the answer is going to be no.
So there's a question in here. Thank you, Autumn. I think she flagged it. Just curious, are people in the LGBTQ community considered part of the disability community? And it's because I'm making a lot of references. And so that's my bad. No, I'm just bringing up different communities as comparable examples. No,
yeah, I mean, I think it's really appropriate to think about what we can learn from building inclusive environments for folks in the LGBTQ community that have implications for building inclusive environments for people with disabilities. Not to say that if you're gay, you're disabled, although there are plenty of people who are both gay and disabled,
right.
Not because they're gay, but because of some other condition, or because of a physical or mental impairment. Being gay is not a condition. But like the idea of being out at work and coming out and how to come out and the value of being out at work, all of that, to me, there are parallels between creating a work environment that works well for people who are part of the gay community and for people who are part of the disability community. I think building a work environment that doesn't make assumptions about people and tries to be welcoming to all is something that works well for people with disabilities, but it also works well for a lot of other folks in different marginalized communities.
We talk about a lot, and we're hearing more about a lot now as the conversation around D&I grows, is the idea of intersectionality. Mm-hmm. And that is, so for me, intersectionality, I have three aspects of the communities that come together. It's Black, woman, disability. So neither one of those individually defines me, but all of those are a part of me. And so to your point, you can be in the gay community, you could have a disability, or you could be somebody who's gay with a disability. It's not an either or sentence. And any one of those combinations could be of a different generation, speaks a different language, in a different socioeconomic group, and the list goes on. And
I think, the other thing to remember about disability is you can move in and out of that category.
Yes.
Disability is inherently a broad category that is not static. So, from an employer perspective, I encourage employers, when I spoke at Grant Thornton, I remember they wanted me to talk about mental health in the workplace. And I encouraged them to think about your top performers, the people that everybody would agree is a rock star in this organization. I said probably a fifth of them have depression or anxiety or some other high incidence mental health condition. So can you create an environment at Grant Thornton where they're comfortable being open and asking for accommodations that might help them perform even better? And if you're unable to create that environment, you may lose some of your best people and never know that part of the reason you're losing them is they don't feel comfortable being out and open in your environment. So I just think, in the disability world, we have this concept of universal design. I think you want to create a work environment where anybody in your employee can acquire a disability at any time and still feel welcomed and valued and be able to be their best self in your office, even if they didn't have that disability when they started working for you.
So a couple of things I've learned from you today on definitions of disability, who we count in those groups based on, for example, what you said about unemployment. I've read some statistics that talk about how I think it's something like 1 in 4 of us will experience a disability in our lifetime. And that number grows as we get older, which means somebody who might be watching today in their 30s or 40s might not have a disability, but might have one by the time they get to be in their 50s. So it does change the conversation in terms of awareness and understanding. Have you noticed people becoming more aware, younger, or is it always just those of us, once we have one, all of a sudden we're aware of it?
You know, when I worked for Senator Harkin, he used to talk about the ADA generation. And what he meant by that is the group of young people who grew up in the United States after the passage of the ADA. And I think our experience of that generation is there's a heightened sensitivity to disability as part of human diversity. There's more, for people that actually have a disability in that generation, they tend to be more out and open and more proud of their disability. And, you know, just inclusive education has resulted in more kids without disabilities growing up in classrooms alongside kids with disabilities. Mm-hmm. So I think there is some generational shift happening, and I'm kind of excited to see as millennials and the folks coming after them move in more and more into leadership roles in the workplace, will they create more disability friendly and more diversity friendly work environments? I think they will. I'm optimistic about that. And I also think that's true for mental illness. I think young people tend to be more political around mental illness. Like if you have a mental illness and you're not getting the services that you need on a campus, lots of young people are organizing on campus to force the university to provide better services. That was not happening when I was a college student.
I think diversity is seen so differently today. And to your point, millennials see diversity as all of the different aspects of myself. And so the embracing of mental health as something that we should see and not shame and support is very different for that generation. All right, I'm looking at the time and now I'm slightly panicked. So I'm going to throw some questions at you. So this one, actually, I started reading it and I got emotional. So I'm going to try not to get emotional when I read it. Okay, that's not working. Thanks for covering this important topic. I recently caused alarm for my neighbor when I said I was having suicidal ideation and couldn't come out and play. It's a tough subject and I wish I could be more open about it because I think it would help a lot of people. This is something that I've experienced very near to me in family and friends. So it's an example of how far mental illness can take us if we're not willing to have these conversations. Because
you know, do you want me to respond to that,
yes.
Jina, or did you? Okay. I think one of our deficits as a culture is we don't know what to say when somebody says they're not doing well. And it's very unusual for somebody to say, I'm thinking about killing myself, you know, and when somebody says that, most of us don't know how to respond. We don't know kind of where to get them help, the best way to respond. There's an organization called the Crisis Text Line, which was started by data scientists. And I heard a presentation from the people who started that. And, you know, this is where you can text to get help from a trained mental health professional if you're having a mental health crisis. And the number of young people who use that is astronomical. Like one of the cohorts that is the highest cohort that use that crisis text line are 13-year-olds.
Wow.
And part of it is because texting is a comfortable way for them to ask for help. It's, you know, they don't have to talk to a person. They're doing it through a machine. The machine is like breathing for them. They've grown up around that machine. And that's how they ask for help, and that's how they're getting help. And then the data scientists are able to analyze, the language that people use, and they know, okay, this is an emergency, and it needs a different kind of intervention than this kind of language. So it's just interesting to me that data science is being used in a way to help sort out the people who are most at risk of killing themselves from people that aren't. But I think we as a culture need to learn what is the best way to respond when somebody says, I'm thinking about killing myself. And I feel like that is a huge cry for help. It needs to be taken seriously, but it's also really important that you not react in a way that makes it worse.
Right.
And one of the things that happens to a lot of people when they say that is they get hospitalized against their will. They get admitted to a hospital, and sometimes it's just they need it. They're having a bad day. They're venting to somebody who they love, and they don't have to be admitted to a hospital. And being forced into a hospital that they don't want to be in can traumatize them, can be worse. So kind of sorting that out is not a simple thing. And I know there's been a lot of emphasis on, call the suicide prevention line, and there are people on those lines who are trained. There are suicide prevention lines that are targeting folks that are dealing with bad reactions from their families around them being gay or transgender, and so I think all of those resources are helpful, but I don't think it's one size fits all, and they're not all equally effective depending on your personal life experience. They're going to work better for some people than for others.
So there is a ton of statistics being shared by one of our participants, and I don't know if this is a participant that works with you. But one of the things that I thank you for sharing this, ada.gov is the website for those who want to go and find more information.
Yeah, that's the kind of central website managed by the U.S. Department of Justice, which is the lead federal agency that enforces the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they've got a lot of good technical assistance documents on that website.
Somebody's asking about, so on one of the previous screens, I had listed some of the barriers had to do with employment. So what about screening candidates? Let me throw another one. There was another one in here about job descriptions. Are there words or processes here that create barriers or challenges?
Yeah, so as you probably know, Jina, a lot of employers are using artificial intelligence and algorithms to try to kind of sort out people that can make it to the next stage of an interview process. And if you're autistic or you have other types of disabilities, you may kind of show up as being problematic and not make it past the algorithm, in part because your disability interprets the questions differently, and it's not fair. It's not a fair assessment. Generally, the things that we do to try to screen out people before they get to an interview are not going to be good for a lot of people with different types of disabilities. This also for people with intellectual disabilities, a lot of those screening tests are not accessible and not helpful. So, I think it's important as an employer, if you're going to employ this new technology, ask the vendors who you're partnering with, what is the data on how this technology plays out from an equity standpoint? Are there groups that tend to perform better on these tests than others, and show me your equity data across the board, not just disability, gender, race, ethnicity. Am I creating a discriminatory barrier here by using this? Because they'll only tell you the upside. They'll tell you, oh, this is a great way for you to not hire the wrong people and kind of have a leg up and not waste your time interviewing candidates that are not going to be good performers. In my experience, nothing is that simple. No matter how good the computer screening is, there's no perfect way to screen out problematic people, and there are lots of ways to screen out good people.
Right. Thank you. That's a beautiful way of saying it. So we're almost out of time. Before we do that, I want to share with folks And you all have this in your handout. There are several articles that you shared with me, so I wanted to share it with them. You have the title, the date, and the publication, so you can find all of these online. So I'm just clicking through them. They're all about the topics that we talked about today. By the way, thank you for this one. I love this article and I love this picture. And then this last one about business in particular.
Jina?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Yes, we are not able to, yes, but we are not able to see your slide at the moment if you were showing the attendees a particular slide.
Really? What do I do here? Unshare and reshare?
Yes, you can.
Show my screen 1. Can you see it now?
Yes, I see the questions slide. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll click back through. You guys have this in the handout. So these are the 4 articles that we have there. And before we wrap up, I know we have to do our 4th question, our 4th polling question.
Yes, I can go ahead and launch that now. Would you like that?
Yes, please.
Okay, here is our 4th and final poll.
You know, Andy, I was listening to a speech the other day, a presentation on a conference, and I heard an interesting story about the evolution of what we now know to be audiobooks, and how the initial iterations of that type of software technology wasn't for those of us who could see. It was for those who needed the auditory support because they couldn't see. And it's an example of how when we provide tools and resources for the most marginalized communities, what we often find is that same solution benefits everyone. So you mentioned something about that earlier, and it just reminded me of that.
Yeah, the typewriter or the keyboard is another example of something that was originally developed as an accommodation for somebody with a disability because they weren't able to kind of write in a legible way with handwriting. So yeah, there are lots of examples where disability applications have led to innovation that everybody benefits from.
Thank you, and there are the results.
Yeah, 56% say their organization does include disability in their D&I efforts. And for the 30% who said they're not sure, I encourage you to go back and ask. And so with that, Andy, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we could have talked for 3 more hours. So that was really helpful. Next 2 weeks, so this webinar is every 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, Terry Pierce is joining me to talk about diversity recruiting. Last thing I'll say is that if you have any questions at all, if you go to Andy's slide with his bio at the very bottom, all of those are clickable links, so you can reach him and follow him on Twitter. I follow you on Twitter. It's a lot to follow. So you can reach out to us, and you can also click these little icons here at the bottom. You can reach out to me, and we encourage you to if you have questions, please ask. We're here to help. So thank you for joining us today, everyone, and thank you, Andy, for being here today.
Thank you, Jina. It was my pleasure.
Thank you to the both of you. We always enjoy having you with us. Thank you so much. And with that, we have come to the conclusion of today's webinar. We here at CPA Academy will process your credit later today. That, along with a copy of this webinar and evaluation link, will be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. All questions asked today will be forwarded in a full report to the presenter as well. I see some great comments coming in, and I thank Jina and Andy for their great content. I know I learned a lot today. Thank you so much. And thank you to our members for your participation. Please check the schedule on our website for additional information, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Have a great day, everyone.